Let's say the motion was that this House believes that citizens in states with declining populations have a moral obligation to have children. What I want to zero in on this video is the way in which you could potentially frame the concept of a moral obligation. What does it mean to be obliged to do something? Why should we ought to do something? Well, the first question that may likely be contested is whether or not citizens have an obligation to the collective interest of the state in which they are a part of, or in this case, the state with a declining population. Why should particular citizens be obliged to have children for a state? Or in other words, why do we have an obligation to a government, a people, or a collective identity and community? Government in this debate may argue that because citizens benefited from state resources, they then have a reciprocal obligation to the collective future existence of the state, because to do so otherwise would be to inflict direct harm on others, which of course necessitates an explanation as to the various social and economic harms of a continuing declining population, which is not so difficult to prove. On the other hand, opposition may explain that this relationship and obligation does not exist, or at least should not be facilitated through having children. This obligation, as they may argue, may exist minimally through taxes, but it would be too much to expect people to become parents or to invest resources that they otherwise could have used to improve their own lives outside of having children too. And of course, implicit in this argument is the idea that to sacrifice for a collective interest means to sacrifice individual interest or your individual autonomy, which you'd argue to be more important in this instance. Secondly, related to the earlier question is the second issue, which is, funnily enough, whether it is good to have children at all. And I encourage you to interrogate this question further, because independent of whether or not having children is a good or a bad solution to the problem of a declining population, because that is its own debate, is the question of whether it is justified to expect that citizens should shoulder the burdens and costs of having a child in the first place. Government here may explain that citizens in declining populations, especially since these states are typically of higher income, have an obligation to have children because they can provide for a good life, which is the capacity for agency and experience that a potential life can have. And of course, opposition can use this opportunity to question whether it is morally good to bring children to this world at all. It's not only unnecessary, but it might be wrong to bring children into a life of suffering. And of course, that is something that could be proven in a debate as well. It's also possible to explain further that this obligation is not fair because it is not proportionally allocated, because women particularly are expected to shoulder disproportionate burdens through child rearing and through parenting. So of course, we can't prove that a moral obligation exists if it is something that is unfairly distributed in the population. So what's the lesson from this brief prep time? Well, there are multiple dimensions when it comes to assessing moral obligation. This includes determining what is relatively good and bad, whether this is equitable and fair given the expectations of power dynamics that are at play, and of course, how this measures up to the existing obligations that individuals may be argued to have as being part of a state. And of course, this involves the numerous analogies and the proofs of those analogies as to why this is the case in the status quo. All right, that's it for today's video. Thank you everyone and have a wonderful day.